After the party, I think we should talk. I've made a decision. The words slipped past his lips with the same casual detachment he used when ordering his usual black coffee, no cream. We were standing in the middle of our backyard, under strings of soft golden lanterns swaying gently in the June breeze. The garden was alive with laughter, clinking glasses, and the scent of jasmine curling from the trellis above us. Our son, Beckett, had just given a short, nervous speech thanking everyone for coming. He was glowing with pride and anticipation, first in his class from Duke, headed to Georgetown Law in the fall. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration, a memory, a mark of success, not just his but ours as a family. I turned my head slightly as Grant leaned in, his breath warm against my ear, and delivered his message with all the ceremony of a weather report. My husband of 27 years. The man I had supported, defended, and believed in through a lifetime of storms, dry spells, and social dinners we both secretly hated. I've made a decision. That was the part that echoed. The formality of it. The finality. I didn't flinch. Didn't blink. My smile held steady as I nodded and replied, "Of course." Later. My voice was soft, deliberate, every syllable floating out as if I had just reminded him to take the shrimp off the grill. Inside, though, something ancient and primal shifted. My name is Laurel Danner, and I'm 54 years old. For nearly 3 decades, I've lived in Asheville, North Carolina, in a cedar-shingled colonial house with black shutters and a wraparound porch Grant insisted on repainting every spring. The house sits just east of Grove Park, tucked into a quiet pocket where mountain air mingles with old money and legacy lives are quietly curated behind rose hedges and historic plaques. When we first moved here, I was 27, newly married, and just months out of Vanderbilt Law. I'd graduated top 10%, back when I thought I'd argue environmental policy in front of the Supreme Court. But then Beckett happened, and Grant's firm took off. And every time I considered taking the bar in North Carolina, something came up. First, Grant needed help managing the firm's back office. Then Beckett's preschool had an opening we couldn't pass up. Then we moved. Then Grant's mother got sick. The story was always the same, later. Eventually, later became never, and I accepted the role everyone expected me to play, the perfect wife behind the perfect man. I hosted fundraisers for the Junior League, served on the board of the Botanical Gardens, and planned every detail of Beckett's childhood down to the monogram on his nursery pillows. Grant built his name. I kept the home and the appearances flawless. And for a long time that was enough. Or so I told myself. As I stood in that garden, surrounded by paper lanterns and clinking toasts, I watched my husband move through the crowd like a statesman, shaking hands, laughing easily, refilling guests' wine glasses. He kissed our son's forehead and slipped a folded check into his palm, one final symbolic gesture of fatherly pride. He looked every bit the admired local attorney, the man whose firm had defended half the county's most respectable families through divorce, estate battles, and quiet scandals that never made the papers. The man people trusted, respected, celebrated. And yet, in the space between hors d'oeuvres and the lighting of sparklers, he chose to whisper that our life together was over. No fight. No apology. No explanation. Just a quiet exit strategy, rehearsed and deployed with surgical precision. He'd waited until the perfect moment, when I was encircled by friends, neighbors, and distant relatives, when my focus was on our son, on gratitude, on composure. A moment so steeped in sentimentality and southern politeness that any reaction beyond a gentle smile would have branded me dramatic, unstable, hysterical. He cornered me with precision. Or so he thought. But what Grant didn't know, what he hadn't even considered, was that I had already known. 4 months. I'd seen it coming like a storm on the edge of a warm summer evening, too distant to hear yet but unmistakably there. First, it was small things, a new cologne he never mentioned. Long drives to client meetings that didn't appear on his calendar. The sudden adoption of almond milk, when for 20 years he'd sworn it was for hipsters and birds. He was changing. But not in the way people do when they grow. He was transforming in secret, like someone preparing to shed a skin. I had played along at first, pretended not to notice the overly cautious way he spoke about his new associate, a woman I'd met once at the firm's holiday mixer. Maren Langley. Late 20s. Brilliant smile. Too confident by half. She'd complimented my shoes and made eye contact with Grant like he was the only man in the room. Till I said nothing. I played the game he assumed I didn't know existed. 'Cause I needed time. Time to understand how far this had gone. Time to prepare. And time to ensure that when he finally decided to pull his elegant, premeditated ripcord, he would find every single exit already sealed behind him. But that story comes later. Tonight, I smiled for the camera. I waved to guests. I dabbed my eyes when Beckett hugged me tight and thanked me for everything. And when Grant caught my gaze from across the yard, lifting his glass as if to toast the life we had built, I raised mine too, matching his warmth, his charm, mirroring the illusion. Even as I stood in that garden, under the Carolina stars, watching my husband begin to quietly dismantle our life, I already had the first brick in my hand. There wasn't a single moment when I knew, no dramatic discovery, no lipstick on the collar, no perfume I didn't wear. Instead, it was the silence that gave him away. The way he stopped humming when he walked into the kitchen. The way he kept his phone face down even when it buzzed. The way conversations with him started feeling like interviews, measured, efficient, emotionally hollow. Began in early February, about 5 months before the party. I remember because it was still cold enough to keep the fireplace going, and Grant had taken to spending long evenings in his study with the door half closed. He told me he was preparing a big case, something involving land use zoning in Rutherford County. The way he said it, with just enough detail to sound legitimate but not quite enough to answer follow-up questions, made my stomach twist. One night, I brought him a cup of chamomile tea, something I'd done for years without fanfare. He barely looked up from his laptop. Just said thanks and kept typing. I stood in the doorway a moment longer, watching the light from the screen flicker across his face. That's when I saw it. A brief reflection in his reading glasses, a text thread. I couldn't see the words. Just the layout, a long blue bubble followed by 3 shorter gray ones. He laughed. Quietly. To himself. Then he glanced up and closed the laptop a little too quickly. "I'll be up soon," he said. "Just finishing a few contracts." He kissed me absent-mindedly as I turned to go, but his lips barely brushed my cheek. It was nothing. It was everything. I didn't say a word. Just went upstairs, curled under the comforter, and stared at the ceiling while the wind tapped gently at the windows. That night I didn't sleep. I began remembering things I'd dismissed as quirks or coincidences. His sudden interest in new clothes, a perfectly tailored navy suit that arrived without a word, still in its Bergdorf Goodman garment bag. When I asked about it, he waved it off. "Client gift," he said. "You know how they like to spoil their lawyers." Except I'd never known a client to gift a $3,200 suit. Or the networking dinner in Charlotte that ended with him coming home at 2:10 a.m., breath minty, shirt pressed, hair perfectly in place. He claimed traffic, but I checked Google Maps. Takes 2 hours and 10 minutes to get from Charlotte to Asheville. Even at midnight, that timeline didn't make sense. Then there was the change in how he spoke about Maren, the new associate. At first, she was sharp. Then she was a fast learner. Then she became Langley, spoken with a forced detachment that rang louder than affection ever could. He stopped saying her name completely around me. I'd ask how the office was, and he'd say, "Busy." My associate's handling most of it. No mention of who. Just, "My associate." One afternoon, I dropped off lunch at the firm, a tradition I'd kept for over a decade. When I arrived, the receptionist looked surprised. "Didn't Grant tell you?" "He's at the courthouse with Ms. Langley." I smiled politely and left the food anyway. That night, I asked him how court went. He blinked, confused for a half-second too long, then smiled and said, "Routine. Nothing interesting." He didn't mention that he hadn't been alone, so I started paying closer attention. I didn't snoop yet. I didn't follow him or hack his passwords. What I did do was watch. Closely. Quietly. I noted the shift in his routines. Longer showers in the morning, shorter conversations at night. He used to tell me everything. Rants about difficult judges, stories about clients who cried in his office. But now, his updates came pre-packaged. Sanitized. His phone, which once lay forgotten on kitchen counters and nightstands, now traveled with him from room to room. Once, I reached for it to silence a notification while he was folding laundry, and he snapped around so quickly I flinched. "Don't," he said, a little too sharp. "I'll get it." He smiled a second later, tried to soften the moment with a kiss to my forehead. But something had already fractured. Then came the final straw, the one that shifted me from doubt to certainty. I had been clearing out the junk drawer in the mudroom when I came across a receipt tucked into the back of a gardening magazine. Not unusual. Grant has always been careless about paperwork. It was from the Laurelwood Inn, a boutique lodge just outside Brevard. I recognized it because it's where we'd stayed for our 10th anniversary. The receipt was dated 2 weeks ago. 1 room. 2 guests. A bottle of Veuve Clicquot charged to the room. No business conference. No legal notes scribbled on the back. Just a clean white receipt, crisp and careless. Hidden but not hidden well. That night, while Grant slept beside me, his breath steady, his arm heavy across my waist, I stared at the ceiling and made a decision of my own. He thought he was the only one with a plan. But I had 27 years of knowledge. 27 years of access, of trust, of behind-the-scenes control. He had secrets. I had leverage. And I was done pretending not to see the truth. There's a peculiar kind of stillness that follows betrayal. It's not quiet. It's clinical. The emotions go somewhere deep, below the surface, like oil slipping beneath water. And what remains is a sudden, almost terrifying clarity. That's what I felt the morning after I found the Laurelwood in receipt. Grant left early, claiming a breakfast meeting with a new client. He kissed me on the cheek, told me not to wait up, and walked out the door wearing that same tailored navy suit and the confidence of a man who believed he still had the upper hand. I poured myself a second cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen island, and opened my laptop. No rage. No tears. Just focus. For the first time in years, I allowed myself to think like a lawyer again. I started small. Our joint credit card was the obvious entry point. Grant never paid attention to statements. He left that to me, assuming household finances meant groceries and lawn care. But I'd always been meticulous. And now I was hunting. Within an hour, I had flagged several charges that didn't belong. A dinner at Curate, one of Asheville's most expensive Spanish tapas restaurants, on a night when Grant claimed to be working late at the office. A jewelry store in Atlanta I'd never heard of, Lorraine's, known for its bespoke engagement settings. And a boutique hotel in Charleston. 2 nights. Waterfront suite. All charged under the same card. All passed off as business. Next, I checked our investment accounts. That's where things got interesting. There were transfers, quiet, small ones at first. A few thousand here, 5,000 there. But over the past 6 months, they'd increased in both frequency and boldness. A total of $94,000 had been moved out of our joint brokerage into a secondary account listed only under his name. That account had a name I didn't recognize, Langley Consulting LLC. I stared at it for a long time. It was subtle, elegant, just enough misdirection to avoid suspicion unless someone was looking closely. But I was now looking very closely. I opened a second browser tab and typed in the name Catherine Webb. She wasn't a stranger. Catherine had gone to law school with my cousin Elliot, and she'd made a name for herself as a private investigator who specialized in financial misbehavior, corporate infidelity, asset shielding, offshore accounts. She was discreet, surgically precise, and extremely expensive. Exactly what I needed. We met the following week in the corner booth of a quiet cafe in Biltmore Village. Catherine arrived early, ordered black coffee, and slid a leather-bound notepad across the table before I could even finish introducing myself. "I assume you're not here to talk about a prenup," she said, her tone flat, professional. "Not yet," I replied. "First, I need proof. Then I need to know what he's hiding. Everything." Catherine nodded. Spoken like someone who already knows the answer. "I do," I said. "I just need the receipts." Within days, she had them. Photographs. Travel logs. A full dossier on Maren Langley, 29, Cornell law graduate, relocated from Atlanta 2 years ago. Unmarried. No family in town. She had once clerked for a judge Grant golfed with twice a month. According to Catherine, Maren had dined with Grant 9 times in the past 6 weeks, each time at a different restaurant, always out of town. They had spent 2 weekends together at short-term rentals booked under shell companies. Grant had even rented a loft apartment in her name for business purposes. A modern space in the River Arts District with exposed brick, an open kitchen, and a monthly rent nearly double what we paid for our first home. But what turned my stomach wasn't the intimacy. It was the preparation. Grant had been planning this for months. He wasn't just having an affair. He was building a new life. Quietly, methodically, legally. He'd established multiple LLCs, opened separate credit lines, and even rerouted part of the firm's quarterly bonuses through a holding account I'd never seen. He wasn't leaving in a fit of passion. He was transitioning, like a CEO stepping down from one board and joining another. And through it all, he assumed I was too distracted, too domesticated, too soft to see it coming. But I was done playing soft. With Catherine's help, I compiled a full financial map, accounts, transfers, contracts, and photographs, everything meticulously time-stamped and cross-referenced. I backed up the entire file to a password-protected USB drive, then made 3 copies, one for my attorney, one for safe deposit, and one locked in the false bottom drawer of Beckett's old desk. Then I called Derek Cole, my former colleague and now one of Asheville's top estate lawyers. He referred me to Maureen Adler, a shark in the courtroom and an expert in high-asset divorce negotiations. I scheduled a consultation the following Monday. Grant thought I was at my weekly garden club luncheon. Maureen didn't blink when I laid out the evidence. "He's siphoning marital assets into private channels," she said, flipping through the folders. "That's textbook dissipation. We can claw all of this back." "I don't want a war," I told her. "But I do want him cornered. Quietly. Cleanly. No drama, just facts. I want him to walk into the trap he thinks he built for me. That," she said, smiling coldly, "is my specialty." We worked for 2 weeks restructuring my legal and financial positions. Using irrevocable trusts and separate legal protections, we moved every major family asset, our home, the lake cabin, the rental properties, into insulated vehicles Grant couldn't touch without my written consent. We split accounts, froze lines, notarized everything. On the surface, I continued life as usual. I texted Beckett about his move to D.C., shopped for party supplies, hosted our neighbors for wine and lemon bars. And at night, when Grant climbed into bed smelling faintly of soap and someone else's perfume, I smiled and let him believe I was still asleep. He had no idea the walls were closing in. The man who thought he could orchestrate his smooth, elegant exit had just walked into a cage. He just didn't know it yet. The jazz quartet had shifted to softer standards. Moon River hummed somewhere beneath the clinking of glasses and the hum of old friends reminiscing. The garden was bathed in a soft amber glow from the hanging lanterns, and our son was beaming as he made his rounds, thanking guests and graciously dodging questions about internships and future clerkships. Everything looked perfect. And that, I suppose, was why Grant chose that exact moment to destroy it. He waited until the sun had dipped behind the hills and the first guests began collecting their coats. I had just returned from checking on the dessert table. Someone had knocked over a plate of lemon tartlets, and I was adjusting a linen runner when I felt him step behind me. His hand rested gently on my lower back. Warm. Familiar. Deceptive. "After the party," he whispered, his breath close to my ear, "I think we should talk. I've made a decision." That was it. No apology. No context. Not even my name. Just that cool, clipped cadence he used with underperforming associates. The kind of voice that told you the verdict had already been signed and sealed. All that remained was for you to accept it with dignity. I didn't turn around. I didn't ask what the decision was. 'Cause I already knew. "Of course," I said smoothly, brushing a non-existent crumb from the tablecloth. "We'll talk later." He waited a beat, as if expecting resistance. When it didn't come, he gave a shallow nod and walked away, confident that he had done something both merciful and brave. I watched him go, admiring how perfectly he played his part. His posture, his expression, the gentle handshakes and shoulder squeezes as he made his way back toward the crowd. The devoted husband. Proud father. The man whose name was printed on every invitation. Across the garden I caught sight of Marin Langley. She was dressed in soft rose chiffon, modest but carefully tailored. Elegant, expensive. Her hair pinned up just enough to show off the delicate earrings I recognized, Tiffany pearls. I hadn't seen them before, but I knew the box they came in. I'd found the receipt in our shared banking portal a month ago. Grant had labeled it Client Appreciation Gift. She stood near the floral archway, sipping from a crystal flute, her eyes moving occasionally to where Grant lingered near the bar. She wasn't watching him. She was tracking him. She thought she was about to inherit something permanent. I wondered if she realized she was already part of a strategy, not a life. The photographer called us for family photos. Grant slipped his arm around my waist as we stood under the arbor, Beckett between us, smiling as if nothing in the world had changed. His hand was firm, even possessive. I let it rest there. We posed like that for nearly a dozen shots, the picture of a successful marriage. 2 proud parents. 1 beautiful legacy. Every flash of the camera was a frame of fiction. Later, as the guests began to filter out and the jazz softened into ambient hums, Grant drifted back to my side, wineglass in hand. His tie was loosened now, his smile easy. "He looked so grown up tonight," he said, nodding toward Beckett, who was deep in conversation near the fire pit. "He did," I agreed, my voice low and composed. Grant stared ahead for a moment, then turned to me. "I didn't want to say anything before the party. I wanted it to be a good night." "It was," I replied. "Lovely. But I think it's time we make some changes." I turned to face him, my expression soft. "What kind of changes?" "I've been thinking." "For a while." "About us. About the future. I think we need a clean break. Nothing messy. No fighting." He paused, waiting for the tremble in my lips. For the pleading. Confusion. But I gave him none of it. "A clean break," I repeated, nodding once. "That sounds reasonable." He blinked. Not what he expected. "I mean, obviously, we'll figure out the details. I'm happy to be generous. I just want to do this the right way." "I'm glad to hear that," I said, reaching into the clutch I had carried all evening. "Because I've prepared a few things that might help." I handed him a slim, manila envelope. He looked at it like I'd just passed him the dessert menu. "What's this?" "Everything you'll need for your fresh start." His brow furrowed as he opened it. The first page was the petition for divorce, filed 3 weeks earlier under irreconcilable differences in Buncombe County. Attached were asset disclosure forms, itemized bank transfers, photocopies of every unauthorized transaction, and a detailed list of protected holdings, all restructured and legally sealed. He flipped through them slowly. page after page. First confusion, then understanding, then panic. "These transfers," he began, his voice tight, "were made illegally," I finished for him. "To accounts I'd already moved out of joint control weeks before. You're welcome to keep making transfers, of course. They'll just serve as additional evidence of dissipation." He stared at the pages, his hands beginning to tremble. "You can't do this. I already have, Grant. This is months of preparation." "Correct. You've known. Longer than you've imagined." He lowered the envelope, his face pale now, lips parted slightly like he might still be able to talk his way out of this. "Laurel, I wasn't trying to hurt you." I almost laughed. "Then you should have whispered something else to me at our son's graduation party." He said nothing, because what was there left to say? I reached for my glass of champagne and took a small sip. The bubbles were nearly gone. Party was nearly over. The illusion broken. "You said you wanted a clean break," I added. "So let's make this clean." He opened his mouth, closed it again. He looked out across the garden, the last of the guests leaving, the catering staff packing up trays and linens, Beckett hugging a friend goodbye. His perfect exit was gone. And he was finally beginning to realize he hadn't planned the ending. I had. After our brief conversation in the garden, the one where Grant finally told me, I watched him float through the remainder of the evening like a man reborn. He was positively serene. He poured drinks for the last remaining guests, kissed Beckett on the forehead twice, and even posed for one more round of photos beside the string lights before the photographer packed up. You'd think he'd just sealed the deal on a vacation home, not whispered a marriage-ending confession between toasts and tiramisu. He thought he had executed a masterstroke. That he had carefully timed his exit to perfection, after the party, after our son's biggest milestone, after years of polite coexistence he mistook for my submission. What he didn't realize was that I had let him believe all of it. I watched him that night the way an architect watches a condemned building, studying its angles, its foundation, its false sense of permanence. He moved around the yard with the confidence of a man who believed he still owned the house. And in many ways, I suppose he thought he did. After the guests were gone, we returned inside. I collected plates and glasses. Grant removed his tie, kicked off his shoes, and sighed like someone who'd survived something emotionally taxing. Then he poured himself a neat bourbon and settled into his leather armchair in the den, ankles crossed like a king at rest. "That went better than I expected," he said. "Yes," I replied from the kitchen. "Everything went exactly as it should." He smiled, thinking I meant the party. And that was the thing. He truly believed this would be clean, controlled, private. That I would cry quietly in the shower, ask for a modest settlement, maybe move into a smaller place in West Asheville and start taking watercolor classes. He believed I would leave the estate. He believed I would leave the business accounts. He believed I would leave the story of our life in his hands. He didn't yet know that the estate was already in a protected trust, with Beckett named as the beneficiary. That the business line of credit had been restructured under new legal terms he no longer qualified for. That every romantic weekend, every gift to Marin, every business dinner he'd tried to bury under fake invoices, I had a copy of it all. And I wasn't planning to go quietly. But I didn't need to yell. I didn't need to throw anything. My silence was louder than any confrontation could have been. Over the next few days, I observed him the way a scientist studies a subject unaware it's being watched. Grant began subtly preparing his escape. He started clearing out drawers in his office, digitizing files, canceling wine deliveries under the pretense of downsizing. He changed the password to his laptop. He arranged a call with his accountant, claiming it was time to diversify. And in a flourish of predictability, he took Marin on a weekend retreat to Charleston, under the guise of a regional legal conference. I didn't ask questions. I let him go. Because the truth was already in motion, and everything he was building was made of paper. Catherine, my investigator, sent me a complete dossier on their weekend together. Photographs, hotel charges, a shared Uber account, and one particularly foolish selfie of them on a sailboat, which Grant had uploaded to a hidden Instagram account he hadn't realized was linked to our joint Google Drive. His face looked different there. Younger. Lighter. Not happier, just deluded. Like someone halfway through a magic trick and forgetting it was all smoke and mirrors. Meanwhile, I kept preparing my own performance. I met weekly with my attorney Maureen, who reviewed every new bank statement with the precision of a surgeon. Together, we constructed a full case of marital misconduct, asset dissipation, financial concealment, and ethical breaches, not just in our marriage but within his law practice. Grant had used the firm's operating account for several of his private trips, which, legally speaking, opened the door to misuse of client funds, a violation the State Bar would not look kindly upon. But that wasn't the angle I wanted to lead with. I didn't want him disbarred. I wanted him humbled. He had built his reputation on trust, on being the dependable, morally upright legal advisor of Asheville's elite. A family man. A man of principle. The one everyone referred their neighbors to when things got hard. And I wanted him to destroy that by his own hand. So I waited. Patiently. I smiled through Sunday dinners. I nodded when he said he had a conference call. I kept planning Beckett's move to Georgetown, discussing dorm essentials and housing logistics as if our family wasn't crumbling behind the drapes. And Grant kept building his little escape route. Lease agreements. Hotel bookings. Deposits. A joint bank account with Marin's name quietly attached. He even started meeting with a life planner, someone who helped recently divorced men rebuild their next chapter. He was preparing for a life I had already legally emptied of everything he thought he still possessed. The night before Beckett left for Washington, we hosted one final family dinner. Grant grilled steaks. I made roasted asparagus and set the table with our wedding china. We toasted Beckett with good champagne, told embarrassing childhood stories, and laughed until I could almost pretend it was real again. When the dishes were cleared and Beckett went upstairs to finish packing, Grant walked over to me by the sink and gently touched my shoulder. "I know this is going to be a big transition," he said softly. "But I think it'll be good for both of us." "I agree," I said, drying my hands. He smiled again, relief washing across his face. He thought I was softening. That maybe I would let him keep the house. That maybe I'd let him buy me out with a generous check and let him ride off into his curated, clean-slate future with the woman he'd been quietly molding into my replacement. But that night, before I went to bed, I walked to the guest room where I kept the safe box. I opened it, checked its contents one final time. Divorce papers already filed. Financial records. Tax evasion evidence from the past 2 quarters. The flash drive with photos. A notarized affidavit from Catherine. Then I slid a letter inside. Handwritten. Addressed to him. Not angry. Not bitter. Just factual. Because the man sitting across from me didn't realize that the future he'd been planning for 6 months. I had already finished writing its ending. And in the next chapter he would finally turn the page. The morning was unusually quiet. It had rained the night before, a gentle, steady rain that left the gardens smelling of earth and roses. The sky was pale blue, filtered through a lingering mist, and sunlight flickered through the glass panes above our breakfast nook. Grant came downstairs whistling, dressed in that same confident navy suit, freshly pressed. He looked accomplished. Victorious. It was a Tuesday. He thought it was the beginning of his new life. Beckett had left for Washington 2 days prior, and our house had settled into an unfamiliar hush. Grant saw it as the clean break he'd spoken about. Transition point. The soft launch of his next chapter. He buttered a piece of toast, scrolled his phone, and sipped his black coffee while discussing dinner plans, as if we weren't quietly unraveling a 3-decade marriage. "I was thinking we could talk logistics soon," he said lightly. "Housing, finances, how we want to do this." I agree, I said, folding the dish towel over the oven handle. We should be clear. Transparent. He smiled, always mistaking my calm for surrender. I left the room briefly and returned with an envelope. Not manila this time. Cream white. Thick, textured stationery. My handwriting on the front. To Grant. Read this in full. No interruptions. L. He raised a brow, amused. What's this? A head start. He chuckled like it was a joke, leaned back in his chair, and opened it with the same carelessness that had defined most of his decisions lately. I stood by the kitchen island, watching. The first few lines were soft. A gentle preface. You once told me the reason you fell in love with me was because I never needed a spotlight to shine. That I never demanded center stage, just made sure everything behind the scenes ran flawlessly. 4 years I accepted that role. Quiet. Steady. Invisible. And while you were planning your exit, I was documenting every one of your steps. His smile faded by the second paragraph. The firm account you used to pay for your weekends away? I've reported it. Your managing partner will be notified this week. The financial transfers made to Langley Consulting LLC have already been classified as marital asset dissipation. I have statements from our accountant and the private investigator you passed in the lobby last month. You've created a blueprint for your own collapse, Grant. I simply made a copy. I saw the exact moment when the blood drained from his face. He flipped the pages frantically now, skipping ahead only to realize the worst had not been buried. It had been carefully indexed. Our house has been placed into an irrevocable trust. The deed no longer lists you as a co-owner. The lake cabin? Sold. Profits moved into a custodial fund for Beckett. Your personal accounts have been flagged for investigation due to repeated suspicious transfers from joint holdings. Maureen Adler filed the paperwork last Friday. By the time he reached the final page, his hands were shaking. You once told me that endings are best when handled with dignity. I agree. He looked up at me, stunned. For the first time in our entire marriage, truly and fully uncertain. Laurel, this is war. No, I said quietly. This is record-keeping. He stood, then sat again. Opened his mouth. Closed it. Looked down at the letter as if it might change if he blinked hard enough. You blindsided me. Did I? I stepped around the island and placed a second sheet of paper in front of him. It was the settlement agreement. Fair. Unemotional. Thorough. It allowed him to keep his personal car, his retirement account, already frozen, and what remained of his individual savings after restitution. In exchange, he would sign over his interest in the house, forfeit claims to all jointly acquired assets, and agree not to contest the divorce on any grounds. I left a pen on top of it. This doesn't have to be public, Grant. Doesn't have to ruin you. But it will if you make it. He looked at the pen like it was a loaded weapon. You'd really destroy my name like this? No. You already did that. I'm just showing you the receipt. He said nothing for a long time. Then finally, quietly, how long have you known? Long enough to protect everything that mattered. I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I didn't throw the letter or storm from the room. I just stood there. The same woman he had underestimated for years. The woman who had cooked the meals, balanced the books, stayed silent through the late nights and vague explanations. Except now I wasn't silent. I was precise. When I walked out of the kitchen that morning, I didn't look back. I didn't need to, because Grant was still sitting in the same chair, staring at the letter that undid him, not through rage, not through scandal, but through strategy, timing, and complete composure. That was the moment he realized. He had been planning an escape. But I had already drawn the map. And he was the only one who didn't realize it led straight off a cliff. By Friday, the calls started. The first was from Dan Whitaker, Grant's longtime law partner, the man who had vouched for him when he founded Danner and Whitaker back in 2001. He called the house and left a clipped voicemail. "I'm going to assume you already know what's going on. Tell Grant to check his email. We need to talk immediately." I didn't return the call. I didn't need to. By the end of the day, I'd received 2 more messages, one from the managing director at Blue Ridge Financial, the firm handling our long-term estate planning, and another from a representative at the North Carolina State Bar. The unraveling had begun. Grant, true to form, tried to control the narrative. He attempted to get ahead of it, called Dan directly, likely offering some half-baked explanation about marital tension and a difficult transition. He scheduled a private meeting with the firm's board on Monday. He even reached out to our pastor, which felt more like posturing than penance. But it was too late. Paper trail I had handed over to Maureen Adler was already moving through the appropriate hands. The photographs, the LLC registrations, timeline of the financial transfers, the receipts. The receipts told the story better than I ever could. There was no version of events where he emerged untarnished. Not legally, not professionally, and certainly not socially. That weekend, Maren Langley resigned from the firm. I heard it from Catherine first, who had maintained surveillance on their joint accounts. Maren had emptied hers, drained it within hours of receiving a notice from her bank about flagged activity. The Langley Consulting LLC account had been frozen pending review. The deposit on the River Arts loft had bounced. She packed up her office in less than a day and disappeared. She never even sent a goodbye note. Grant called me that Saturday. Twice. I didn't answer. He sent a single text. "You win." I stared at the screen for a long time. That wasn't what this was. I hadn't done any of it to win. This wasn't about punishment. It wasn't even about justice, not really. It was about balance. It was about making sure that the woman who had held it all together for 27 years, who paid the taxes, scheduled the estate meetings, managed the trust accounts, kept his name pristine and his schedule tight, was no longer invisible. Grant wasn't just facing divorce. He was facing reputation collapse. The whispers started in our neighborhood first. Women I'd known for decades, who had hosted book clubs in my kitchen and borrowed my lemon pie recipe, began calling me to check in. They weren't surprised. Not really. Just ready to choose a side. And they chose quietly but clearly. Church the next Sunday I sat alone. But not really alone. People came up one by one, light touches on my arm, hands briefly held, nods of quiet solidarity. No one asked questions. No one needed to. They had all seen Grant's absence, his silence, his withdrawal. And they had seen mine, elegant, composed, bulletproof. Maureen finalized the asset recovery process over the next 2 weeks. Grant signed the divorce agreement without contest. The firm issued a leave of absence statement, though the board had already moved to dissolve his equity share. The DA's office opened a formal inquiry into misuse of fiduciary funds, though it never made the papers. Because I didn't want it to. I had no desire to humiliate him publicly. I wanted him to feel it privately. Every room he walked into would now be different. Every handshake slightly cooler. Every client a little more hesitant. Every invitation suddenly lost in the mail. He had ruined the only thing he ever truly protected. His image. And I had done nothing more than open the curtains. I never responded to his message. There was nothing left to say. We spoke only once more, formally with attorneys present, to finalize logistics. He looked like a shadow of the man who once believed he controlled everything. Suit wrinkled. Eyes tired. Confidence gone. He didn't speak much. Didn't argue. Didn't dare to ask me why. 'Cause deep down he knew. He knew it wasn't the affair. It wasn't Maren. It was the fact that he had built an entire future on the assumption that I would stay quiet. That I would break. That I would fold. Instead, I had outplanned him, paced him, and never once raised my voice. When the meeting ended, I stood, gathered my documents, and turned toward the door. He said my name softly. Laurel. I never thought you had this in you. I paused, just long enough to turn back and meet his eyes. That's exactly why it worked. And then I left. The magnolias are blooming again. They came early this year, fat, fragrant blossoms the color of porcelain, opening wide beneath the same trees that shaded Beckett's graduation party 6 months ago. The same garden. The same chairs stacked neatly in the shed. The same breeze that carries music when no one is singing. But everything is different now. I sit on the back veranda each morning with my coffee, barefoot, watching the light shift across the lawn. There's a new calm in the house, not silence but stillness. A kind of peace I'd forgotten existed. One that isn't earned through the approval of others, but through the quiet knowledge that I chose myself. I didn't move out. That was Grant's prediction, of course, that I'd pack a few boxes, retreat to a condo near downtown, sell the house that bore our name, and let him keep the legend. Instead, I stayed. 'Cause this house wasn't his legacy. It was mine. Every inch of it, the built-in bookshelves I designed, the kitchen I remodeled when Beckett was 5, the flower beds I replanted every spring. It wasn't just a home. It was proof that I had built something beautiful, reliable, steady. And now it belonged to me in name and in law. Beckett visited last weekend. He's doing well in Washington, already neck-deep in casebooks and lectures and internships. He doesn't ask about his father. I think he knows enough to leave the truth alone. I never poisoned his image of Grant. I didn't need to. The facts spoke for themselves. And children, even grown ones, know more than we think. He hugged me longer than usual when he left. You look different, he said. Lighter. I smiled. 'Cause I am. I'm not angry anymore. I don't relive every detail. I don't check on what Grant is doing or where Marin ended up. I don't need to. That chapter closed with such finality that no bitterness remains, only space. And in that space, I've started reclaiming parts of myself I had boxed up and put on hold. I rejoined the environmental law network I left in my 20s. I've started volunteering with a local conservation group, helping small towns navigate land use policy. It's not glamorous, but it feels like mine. Some days I write. Other days I walk the perimeter of the garden with shears in hand, trimming what doesn't belong, encouraging what's still growing. I've come to realize that my greatest victory wasn't what I protected or recovered or exposed. It wasn't the estate or the accounts or the reputation I let collapse under its own weight. It was the quiet reclamation of my own life. For years, I had made myself smaller to fit into someone else's frame. Someone else's narrative of what a good wife should be. Of what a marriage should look like. Of what love is supposed to endure. But love, real love, isn't a contract of sacrifice. It isn't about staying when you're unseen. It isn't about silence as survival. Sometimes the bravest thing a woman can do is listen without reacting, plan without permission, and leave with her name intact. I didn't burn anything down. I didn't scream. I just waited, observed, prepared, and then opened the door as he walked straight into the consequences of his own choices. That's the part they never see coming. Quiet ones. The patient ones. We don't need fire to be powerful. Sometimes all we need is a pen, a plan, and the resolve to never again apologize for our strength. The wind picks up again. Petals flutter, some falling onto the table beside my coffee. I don't brush them away. I let them fall.